Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today we have a hand where we're going to play the J-4 Offsuit. It's not quite where you want to be, but you don't always get to pick if you have good cards. So we're playing 600, 1200 with a 200 ante, which is quite a large ante. And it folds around to me in the small blind with a 38,000 chip effective stack. So we're playing about 35 big blinds deep. This is a scenario where I'm very often going to limp with a wide range. If the player in the big blind plays reasonably well, but not overly aggressively. If the player in the big blind is quite aggressive, I'll probably just fold this, despite the great odds. And if the player is very weak, I'll raise to about 3 or 3.5 big blinds. The reason you want to play a wide range is because you only have to put in 600 more chips into a pot that's going to be, well, you can see the opponent's 1200 plus my 1200 plus the 1800 in the antes, right? So that is about 4,400 or so. So we have to put in 600 to try to win 4,400. That is, those are great pot odds. They're about as great as they come. So with great pot odds, you do need to try to stick around. And if we limp and our opponent checks, that's a huge success. Clearly, we're going to win the pot more than a sixth of the time. And that's good enough. So I'm going to limp. Of course, if he raises our limp, we're just going to fold this hand because this hand's terrible. But to balance that out, we're going to limp with a lot of other good hands as well. If you start limping with a lot of hands, it makes it to where your opponent can't just blindly run you over. What a lot of amateur players do, though, is they raise a lot of their best hands and they just limp the marginal hands in trash, and then they just limp and then fold it every time when they get raised, and that will lead to you being really exploitable. So don't make it very obvious to your opponent that when you limp, you plan to just fold a lot of the time, because then they are going to run you over. You want to make sure that you are trapping them often, and the easiest way to do that is just to limp with a lot of hands. So I do limp. Big blind checks. Flop comes 10-9-8. Obviously, it's very nice to know something about the big blind. If you know that he's really aggressive, you can check raise. If you know he's really passive, you can bet. I don't really know anything about this player, so I'm just going to bet in this scenario. I don't expect to get a lot of folds, but if he does not have a pair or a draw, or even if he doesn't have a decent draw, I mean, if he has a hand like, I don't know, 6-2, he's probably just going to fold, right? Even though that is kind of a draw on 10-9-8. I'm just going to bet, though. If he ever folds, that's great. If he calls, we have plenty of equity. And I can also keep betting again on various turns and rivers. So I like a bet. I don't think we need to go too big. Like I just said, I don't think we're ever going to make him fold a pair, so there's no point in betting big at this point. I think a much better line is to bet small on the flop and then make it a little bit larger on the later streets if we decide to keep betting. So I do bet 1,400, and he calls. I could see a slightly larger turn bet, or flop bet being okay, but that's fine. Turn is a king. So now, if we had queen jack, we would have the straight. Also, if we had a king, we have top pair, which we could certainly bet. And if I had a 10, I would probably keep value betting it. So I decided to bet 3,000, and that is because, like I just laid out, I would like to bet a decent amount of hands here for value. And again, if he folds, that's great. If he calls, we still have some equity. So we'll keep betting. It's usually good to bet with most of your draws that lack showdown value in most scenarios. And this is just a very clean example of this because I have very little showdown value. Rivers is 7. And this is where things get interesting, at least to me, because if I did not have a straight, I don't know if I would be value betting here. Just because it's so easy for my opponent to have a straight. So what should we actually be betting here? I think we should probably be betting in the spot with various queens as a bluff. Like let's say I did have queen X and was bluffing the flop. Or hands like hands with maybe a 5 in it. It's not obviously a great card, but I'm just trying to come up with even potential bluffing hands. We could also bluff with hands containing an 8 or a 7. Because those block our opponent from having stuff like Jack 8 or 8-6. We could bluff with those. That makes some sense. We could bluff with hands containing a 7. I don't know. It's a tough spot because for me to value bet the river, I pretty much need to have a Jack, right? A Jack or better. Therefore, I can't really bluff a ton. But if you think about my range, I really shouldn't have a ton of bluffs because on 10-9-8, The only bluffing hands are a 7 or a jack or maybe a queen. And for that reason, well, most of those hands are going to have some sort of a pair by the river that very easily could be good. So I'm really only betting with the hands that have relatively little showdown value plus the jacks. Keeping that in mind, I don't really have a ton of bluffs. So since I don't have a ton of bluffs, I should bet on the smaller side with my value hands just because I am going to have the straight a lot of the time. And that is what I do in this spot. I do bet 5,000 into the 13,000 pot. If the river was a blank that did not give me a straight, I probably would have been betting much bigger. Just because in that spot I understand I have way more bluffs, right? And as you have more bluffs, you typically should be betting larger. So it's an interesting scenario where when all the draws come in, I need to be betting quite small. I could also see myself betting stuff like King 10 or King 9 if I had it. But even then, I think it's kind of close. I do bet 5,000 though. And the opponent calls. So this hand works out about as well as it could. We win the nice pot with a straight and not much else to see. We bet the flop and the turn with a draw. And then we got there on the river and we kept betting. No fancy play here. So that's going to be it for this hand for PokerNews.com. I want to thank you all for being here. Be sure to check back next week for another fun poker hand.